Hi Year 12s, the purpose of today's video is to examine the examiner's reports, specifically with a focus on section C, which is argument analysis. So we'll primarily look at the 2020 examiner's report, but we'll also look at all the previous years. Sometimes it might be a little bit repetitive, but I think it's important that we're looking at what the examiners are telling us over and over again that they want to see, because if it's mentioned in more than one examiner's report, we can tell from that it's really, really important, and they definitely want us to be paying attention to that when we're writing our Section C argument analysis essay. So let's start by looking at some extracts from the most recent, which was the farmer's speech on drones. So it says that most students could identify Warwick Bandle's concerns about drones impacting the farmers' livelihoods. However, higher scoring students could see a wider complexity in his stance, that drones also offered advantages to the farming community. So what we really want to pay attention to here is that they're asking for complex contentions. Often if the contention that you have outlined in your essay is one really short, simplistic sentence, you've probably missed the greater complexity behind the contention. So a student who said Bandle aggressively attacks drones and calls for them to be banned hasn't got the contention quite right. If we read on, it said that this was a much more simplistic demand for banning tourist use of drones. It was a considered argument for the broader need to change legislation regarding drone ownership. Students were expected to approach the speech in a holistic manner, asking themselves how to persuade its mixed audience of local farmers, Byway Shire councillors, and a small component of tourists through a deliberately constructed combination of argument and language. So what we can take from this also is that the contention expanded as the text went on to focus on the need for change to legislation. So while the contention appeared to be clear from the beginning, at the end, Warwick really brings in, well, this is what we need to do moving forward. We need to look at legislation change. And I think that's a common factor that we see across lots of argument analysis texts, that the contention is really solidified at the end of the text, and that they might add a layer of complexity at the end that may not have been as apparent at the outset. So keep that in mind when you're searching for contention. The other important thing that we gather from this is the mixed audience. So we have here local farmers, councillors, and tourists. And a student who was able to identify multiple audience members is then able to write much more specific reader responses, because they don't just use this empty phrase, the reader is designed to, or the reader is positioned to, or the reader is made to feel this way. Instead, they replace that phrase, the reader, with a specific audience group. And by pointing out a specific audience group, you have a much more specific response from that audience. So next, it told us that while there was confidence in identifying the broader argument, many students needed to focus on the ways in which Warwick Bandle structured and sequenced supporting arguments and consciously and deliberately used language to position his audience in particular ways. So what we really need to pay attention to here is they want us not to just understand what arguments were used, but how those arguments were ordered in a strategic way. So for example, if someone is withholding their contention and instead starting with an appeal to the common values that they hold with a particular audience member. That's very deliberate. That first they want the audience member to recognize the connection between themselves and the orator or the author, and then once they recognize that relationship, their shared beliefs or their shared interests, they then choose to bring forth their contention. And that's a very deliberate structuring of arguments rather than putting forth their contention before they have this relationship established. So one of the ways that students really effectively do this is through their first sentence of any body paragraph. Perhaps their first sentence says, Bandel begins by, but then the next body paragraph first sentence might say, having established the relationship and the common beliefs that Bandel holds with his argument, he then moves on to clearly and in an assertive way deliver his contention that. Then the next paragraph might start with, having been very explicit in his contention, Bandel introduces the idea of economic concerns. And then the next one might begin, having shown his understanding of the economic implication of drones, Bandel then looks at and moves on to the next. So, identification of argument is only the first step in the analysis process. However, many students struggle to move beyond this into analysis mode. There was a pattern to these summary responses, and teachers might find it useful to look carefully at the language some students use when attempting to analyse arguments. The pattern of comments such as, he speaks about, he then goes on to, he talks about, he mentions that, are clear indicators that the student is simply summarising and restating arguments, not analysing them. So, what they don't want to see are phrases like these, because they're very, they lack kind of purpose. They suggest that this person is just kind of having a casual conversation with no real agenda behind what they're trying to do. And that is not the case. Instead, you are looking for phrases such as Bandel contends, Bandel argues, Bandel asserts. They are much more, those terms show that you understand that everything he says has a very direct purpose behind it. It's not just something he says off the cuff with no real purposeful aim to persuade. So here we have an example of a analysis paragraph that was written by a student for this exam. So let's read it and then let's pull apart different aspects of it that are brilliant, because this is a high scoring response. So from the outset, Bandel overlays a logistics argument to candidly illustrate the magnitude of the drone crisis. Indeed, his repeated use of question marks immediately draws on an urgency that appeals to more concerned farmers, framing the issue as severe and worthy of their immediate attention. Subsequently, he taps into the implied destruction of crashing out of the sky with its cataclysmic associations of a meteorite to cultivate a sense of fear and trepidation in more apprehensive local residents. In tandem with the emphatic just imagine, with its association of endless possibilities, Bandel suggests that damage wreaked by drones could devastate all levels of the community. The speaker then shifts to a more impartial tone as he intersplices the objective description when it's swept up, damaging the harvester. Thus, he leads more logic-inclined farmers through a chain of reasoning, positioning them to equate drones with exorbitant damage to equipment. Accordingly, He coaxingly galvanizes these residents to view the recreational use of drones as an impending threat and thus enthusiastically support its ban. So let's break this down into some of the aspects that make this such a great response. First of all, this first sentence. From the outset, that phrase shows an understanding of construction, that he's beginning a certain way and then he might change later. It also gives a very clear focus of the argument that is going to be focused on in this paragraph. And in that way, the student is able to keep themselves focused and not trying to cover too much at once. And it also helps their examiner understand where they're heading. Another thing that they do really well is that they point out multiple different audience groups, which allows for such clever and insightful and specific reader response and different types of reader response. So, concerned farmers are one group. We've got apprehensive local residents as another group. Logic-inclined farmers as another group, and residents as another group. So within this paragraph, they've managed to pull out 4 different audience groups and talk specifically about how they are targeted based on the characteristics that they have, because they do have different characteristics. Some residents are apprehensive, some farmers are concerned, some residents is just a bit more of a general one to be using, but that's really important that you're doing that as well. Another thing that I'd point out that this does really well is it talks about how language is used together and how one approach can build on another approach. So, for example, it says from the outset and then it says subsequently. So from the outset, he does this. Subsequently, he introduces this. Then it says in tandem with this piece of evidence works alongside it. He then shifts to a different tone. So by using these phrases, we're seeing that this person understands not language in isolation, but how language works together. Another great aspect of this writing is these short, efficient use of quotations. There isn't extensive quoting from the text, and that is so important in argument analysis. And then the last thing I'd point out as very important to do is at the end of this big paragraph, they bring it back to the contention. They bring it back to, okay, this works with this, that works with this, and overall, these things work to position the audience to agree with the overall contention. If you only show your understanding of the contention in the introduction and the conclusion, and you're not finishing every body paragraph by drawing all your analysis back to it, that is going to be a huge limitation. Also, I would just say, let's look at this person's language. It's beautiful. A logistics argument candidly illustrates, implied destruction, coaxingly galvanizes. These are just amazing examples of really beautiful language. And what I would encourage you to do is read through multiple different model responses and pull out language that you think is really useful, that strikes you as really sophisticated, learn it and use it in your own writing so you can achieve the same level of sophistication. Okay, next. The 2020 Examiner's Report tells us that students were expected to acknowledge and explore the ways the slides were used in adding visual weight to Bandel's speech. This is one area in which students are most assured in their analytical skills. There were very few students who did not try to work with the visual material. We are dealing with a visually sophisticated generation of students who analyse graphics in interesting ways. Students were not expected to write lengthy paragraphs on the slides. In fact, the shorter, sharper reference often works more effectively, and those who can integrate the analysis of the visual into a broader argument show greater mastery of the task. So, important things here. It does not need to be extensive when you're analysing the visual. Shorter and sharper are preferred, and integrating the visual with an argument rather than alone is really, really important. So when doing visuals, short, sharp analysis of visuals and linking them specifically to an argument within the text rather than looking at them in isolation. Let's have a look at the 2019 report now. So this is for the text that was about a local store going cashless. The best responses identified the overall purpose and intended audiences of the advertorial and letter and used this as their context to structure their analysis of the key stages of the respective arguments and their purpose in positioning the reader. Before closely analysing the particular language and persuasive devices, as in the following example. So what they're telling us here is that students who write high-scoring responses understand the fundamentals before they start looking at small examples of language use. They understand the context, they understand the text type, they understand the audience groups, and when they understand these features, they're then able to have a more holistic examination of language rather than saying, oh, here's a rhetorical question, oh, here's emotive language, but rather we understand an audience group is local residents who are valued customers of the store and regularly attend the store, and that these individuals, specifically because of the changes, might feel intimidated or might feel disappointed that their shopping experience is going to change, and therefore they're going to be targeted in a very specific way. They're going to be reminded that their loyalty is important. They're going to be repositioned to think of this change as not something annoying for their day-to-day shop, but rather something that can improve it. So let's look at what this student wrote. The recent increase, so this is an introduction. The recent increase in the number of cashless stores in society has sparked the perennial debate of whether accepting only credit cards or online forms of payment is a practical advantage or a hindrance for customers. So this student here starts with the context. Here's an issue occurring, and this is the focus of the persuasive text. In her advertorial, this comes directly from the background information and reminds us of the absolute importance of reading that background information. Some students completely missed this year that it was an advertorial, and that was very detrimental to their overall holistic analysis. In her advertorial, published in the local newspaper entitled A Better Faster Shopping Experience, the manager of Haley's local store responds to the issue by ardently lauding cashless stores and announcing her decision to no longer accept hard currency at her grocery shop. So here's the contention. We're changing the way we do things, and it's shaped by ardently lauding cashless stores. So it's got a real positive vibe to it. It's celebrating this new opportunity. It's encouraging residents to be really positive about this change because it's a great initiative. Targeting her valued customers, we have a very specific audience group here. Esther amiably argues the benefits of digital technology as an in an excited and positive tone. What we also want to point out here is these are two very simplistic tone words, but we've heard examiners before tell us that you're better to go for a simplistic tone word and get it exactly right than use a more nuanced, difficult tone word and it not really be the best option. In response to the paid advertisement, one of her customers, Samuel Macaron, scathingly debunks Astare's point of view in a letter to the same newspaper, vehemently arguing the inconvenience and disadvantage of cashless stores. So it introduces the second text as well, and it gives the second text contention and also the second text overall approach. So while the first approach is excited and positive and amiable, the second approach is scathing and it argues vehemently against something. Another thing I'll just point out that this student does really well is using adjectives before they use verbs. So instead of Astare argues, Astare amiably argues. Instead of Morricone argues, he vehemently argues. Instead of Morricone debunks, he scathingly debunks. When you're able to pair the right adjective with the right verb, you're going to find the level of interest and sophistication in your writing is going to skyrocket. 2018 report. Students did well in selecting examples from the material that allow them to demonstrate their understanding of how language is being used to persuade. Students were also expected to analyse how the writer set up his argument and constructed the piece in order to persuade his audience. So I would divide this into two. There are two skills that they're saying need to occur, and I would suggest that the first is the easiest and the second is what the highest scoring responses do. So it's saying students knew how to select examples from the text that helped them to analyse it. And I think as a cohort, we're very good at this too. We're able to see what's important to analyse, and we also understand that there's no way you're ever going to be able to analyse everything. So you pick the best stuff, the most meaty and most interesting stuff to analyse. You don't pick anything that's just not as strong as other options. And also, if you read a sentence in a persuasive text and you think, well, I don't really get what this is doing, that is absolutely fine. Do not analyse it. Stick to what you understand because there is no requirement that you need to analyse everything. The second thing here is coming back to what we've heard in the previous report, that students need to not just be able to pull out individual moments in isolation, but they need to demonstrate how they understand them working together, and that one approach is done first and then very, very deliberately followed with another approach. And there needs to be a reason between that. Why start this way and lead into this approach rather than doing it the other way around? And if you can show the examiners that you understand why they've done that, you have a high scoring response. Okay, 2018 also said that while the majority of students were able to plan their responses so that they could cover both the review and the cartoon, so here we're at Jonty Jenkins and the review of the cafe, a few spent disproportionate amount of time on the cartoon at the expense of offering a sufficient exploration of the text. So, very clearly, and this goes in tandem with what we've just learned, quick, short, sharp analysis of visuals is what they want. Do not analyse a visual at the expense of the written text. In a small number of cases, the cartoon dominated the response, leaving little opportunity to explore insights into argument and written language use. On the other hand, some students ignored the cartoon. Do not ignore the visual. Do not spend too much time on the visual. And again, do not write about the visual in isolation. Link it to an argument. 2018 also said, students on the whole understood the nature of the task and the writer's intended audience. The majority of students were aware of the importance of background information, which set the context from which the writer based his piece. So this is telling us something that we should absolutely already know, that background information is integral. It's like trying to set up a bit of flat pack furniture without reading the instructions. Why make it harder for yourself than it has to be? You don't open a book and start reading a book without looking at the cover and seeing what you can gain from the visuals. You think about the title and what you can gain from the title. You read the blurb and that helps to direct your mind when you start to read the book. You don't just open a book with absolutely no context and think that you're going to understand that book very well. You use the information available to you, and that's what background information is. Use that information, use the layout, use the visuals, use the title, use all that to help direct you before you start reading the text. Many students understood the intention and the implications of the review. Most students avoided simply transcribing or quoting the information, setting out the basis of their piece eloquently in their opening. So how do we avoid simply transcribing? Well, we do what we saw the student do prior. We do short, sharp, small quotations from the text, never lengthy quotations. I also want to take this opportunity to tell you something very important, which is I have seen students who think they've found the contention really explicitly written in the text, and rather than saying the contention in their own words and summarizing it, they quote the contention. Do not do this. Do not quote the contention. You can use quotes within your outline of what the contention is, but do not rely on a quotation from the text to summarize the contention for you. It does not demonstrate your understanding. It said in 2018 that the higher scoring responses had incisive and fluent introduction. So they got the basics down. I know the context, the writer, the text type, how many texts there were, what the contention was, and what the overall approach was. It was positive, or it was an aggressive rebuttal of, or whatever it is, but they didn't stuff around in that introduction. There was no superfluous information. It didn't go over maybe 5 sentences at the most, and then they moved on to their body paragraph, because students who do that, they understand that their points exist in their body paragraphs. Their points do not exist in their introductions and their conclusions. They offered insights into how the writer's argument was set up to persuade. They showed an insight into the way the writer was attempting to connect with his readership and to use this to leverage him in an attempt to persuade. So that understanding of audience and author is so important. They made meaningful and sophisticated conclusions about the use of language in an attempt to persuade. So that's the analysis part. They didn't just say there was an appeal to the community spirit and not then explain how that appeal to community spirit was being used. And then they made sure they followed it up with that this is particularly effective for residents who have lived in the town for a long period of time and feel highly connected to it. And finally, they dealt effectively with the visual and offer worthwhile conclusions about how it supports the text. Okay, in 2017, we moved to the Spire Primary School message from the principal about the use of packaging in school lunches. So here we've got another example of a really short, sharp introduction that focuses on the basics and then quickly moves to the body paragraphs where they can do that in-depth analysis. You'll also notice that this introduction starts exactly the same way as our last introduction did, by showing that they understand the context of the piece. So if in two different examiners' reports, they have showed us two high-scoring introductions that begin with context, then I think it's fair for us to also begin with context. While prepackaged food items have been lauded by some as convenient, others are critical of the corrosive effects on the environment. In a weekly message entitled Principal's Message, Spire Primary School's website, Principal Denise Walker asserts that students, staff, and parents must reduce the use of plastic packaging. So here we have the beginning of the contention, reduce the use of plastic packaging, and we also see that this student is clever enough to understand that we have three different audience groups here, all who are going to be targeted in different ways. With the primary audience of parents with children at Spire Primary School in mind, Walker maintains an intimate and at times punctilious tone. So we've got tone words being used. In response, parent Louise has commented on the message, repudiating Walker's proposal on the basis that it interferes with 21st century living. So here we've got the second text being introduced. We've got her contention for the second text. She employs a critical register, so description of the language, targeting fellow parents and readers of Walker's message. So they also understand that there is multiple audience groups for the second text as well. 2017 also told us that not all students, however, were able to analyse the material, and some simply quoted from the material without any explanation or direct analysis, which did not fulfil the requirements of the task. So we've heard this multiple times now. They know the text. They're not interested in you repeating the text or extensively quoting the text. It's argument analysis for a reason, and your focus needs to be on analysis. 2016, which is the one with the watermelon being built, and it's a debate around whether that's a good idea. Some students presented a response that struggled to offer meaningful insight into language use, and there was little engagement with the task. These responses often did little more than describe the situation in Lawton, and the use of quotations was merely summary. There was virtually no analysis or attempt to analyse the way Wiley or Warwick used language to persuade readers. So again, it is making it very clear to us that they want analysis. Analysis is where our points lie. 2016 also said that there was no expressed expectation that students compared language used by each of the writers, but many offered astute insights by exploring Wiley's language against Warwick's language. Very few went outside the task and evaluated which was more effective. This was clearly not the task. Two very important things here. They could give us one text, they could give us two texts, they could give us three texts, they could give us four texts. What they're saying is, if they give us more than one text, there is no expectation for you to compare those texts. However, if they gave you two texts that had very different approaches, by commenting on that, you might show greater insight into each one. It's not required, but it could help you to show off your understanding of knowledge and that different people take different approaches for different reasons. The second thing that they're telling us not to do, and this does slip into writing sometimes, we've seen it in SACs, is evaluate. Do not say that one text is more persuasive than the other. Do not use Evaluative or judgmental terms such as Walker does a fantastic job of outlining the benefits. No, we're not evaluating, we're analysing. Bandel is really successful in getting fellow farmers on side. No, we are not evaluating, we are analysing. This is how he gets fellow farmers on side, not that he's good at doing it. 2014, while few students resorted to simplistic technique identification, it was still evident. Some students offered topic sentences that suggested they were searching for particular techniques with little regard to the instructions for this section. How is written and visual language used in the newspaper article and the letter in an attempt to persuade readers to share the points of view presented to them? Simply identifying techniques demonstrates a limited approach to the task. This is not new information for us. It says here that they were concerned about students who had topic sentences that focused on techniques. But in accordance with what we've seen before and what we just spoke about, if you are writing your topic sentences for each body paragraph properly, those topic sentences should be focused on arguments, and those topic sentences should be focused on why those arguments are strategically ordered the way that they are ordered. Only within the body paragraphs, when you are finding smaller pieces of evidence to explore the use of those arguments, are persuasive techniques relevant. Should I ever really hear you talking about a persuasive technique in an introduction or a conclusion? No. Tone, yes. Argument, yes. Not so much techniques.